to the Daily Allegory through Astrological Divination. I'm going to do two things today. Our magic motto of the day is summon shadows if you want. Proof always answers louder. And then our word of the day, premeditated. Premeditated legally means an act that was thought out, planned, or considered beforehand, distinguishing it from an impulsive act. It implies a conscious, deliberate intent to commit a crime, mostly murder, not limited to, prior to its execution, requiring some, even minimal, reflection time to form a settled purpose. It's that brief hesitation that distinguishes irrational and rational. This is a crucial element for murder charges, if somebody plans a murder rather than just impulsively murdering. Now, the definition is it is a mental state of planning or plotting a crime before carrying it out. Time factor. When it must involve more than an instantaneous impulsive act, it does not require a long period of planning, and the intention can be formed shortly before the act, as long as reflection occurred. Now, some examples of this are purchasing a weapon, researching a target, mapping out a route before a crime, such as a planned murder for financial gain or strategic coordination within the community to push somebody to a psychological annihilation, stealing somebody's money or property. Other examples include calculated fraud or stalking a victim. That would be just individually stalking or collectively stalking people in a group or society. Now, financial crimes and fraud are systematically diverting funds or planning a complex scheme to defraud a company over several months and or an individual. Now, stalking and harassment is violently targeting a specific person based on prior deliberate decisions to do so, whether it be planned through WhatsApp chat groups, Snapchat, or, Facebook communities. And theft. Planning in advance with specific high-value items to steal rather than taking time on impulse. Now, indicators of premeditation are acquiring tools, stalking and surveillance, time for reflection. This would also include software, shared community resources that might have been siphoned from other people. And it includes a methodical approach, a deliberate, calculated, and organized plan to execute the act. Now, premeditated action always shows a clear conscious intention to cause a very specific result. Our story begins when a longtime grifter panics when a court official demands that they produce a document that they've claimed that they possessed for years. A document that never actually existed. After they used the lie to scam, commit fraud, and siphon money that wasn't even theirs to take. As the legal pressure mounts, their circle tries to fix the problem with graveyard magic and lunar spells aimed at a man they want silenced. He's talking way too much specifically to the crimes that they're committing, only to backfire catastrophically by inadvertently summoning Santa Muerte and the Restless Dead, forces that instead of harming him, reveal he's already protected and bind the would-be spellcasters to karmic recoil of worsening health, financial collapse, and the full weight of everything they've sent out against others, not limited to him. Everybody, past, present, and future. Spirit knows all. When the fraud now visible to the courts, officials serve a notice of appearance that lures the document faker into showing up to represent someone they have zero authority to speak for, catching them in the act and tightening the case into a trap they can't wiggle out of this time. The fallout reaches their enablers too, the doctor who supplied illegal paperwork to prop up the scheme and is prosecuted and sentenced to decades behind bars for conspiracy, privacy violations, malpractice, and fraud, turning what began as a paper lie into an avalanche that buries the entire operation. Today's story is called The Notice of Appearance. The call came at dusk, when the apartment windows turned to mirrors and every reflection looked like a witness. A court official, polite, practiced, impossible to charm, asked for a document that the nameless one had been producing in conversations for years. I no longer use names in my stories. The shoe fits where the shoe fits. Now, the paper that proved authority, the paper that justified money collected, the paper that made the story legal instead of criminal, the voice on the line didn't accuse, it simply requested. Yet the question struck like an electrical match in a room full of gas, because the nameless one did not have this document. They never did. The entire scheme had been built under an Aquarius sun. Cold, clever, networked. Paperwork is theater. Theatrics, if you will. Can I have a paper towel? Legitimacy is costume worn in broad daylight while everyone assumed the costume meant truth. At home, where the sun conjunct Venus in the fourth made lives feel cozy and domestic, the nameless one had framed fake letterheads like family photos and rehearsed sincerity in the kitchen light. But now the official's request turned a home into a stage set collapsing into itself in real time. The nameless one's laughter, always a tool, arrived late, sounded kind of wrong, while somewhere deep in their chest a different clock began to tick. This was the clock of consequence. They called the friends, the ones who believed reality could be negotiated with, the ones who had stood in circles, mouths closed to candle flame, speaking names like locks. With the Pisces stellium, Venus, Mercury, and the North Node, their world was fog and longing, sweet talk and dissolving boundaries, signs and synchronicities used like excuses. Their messages started arriving in sympathetic waves. We'll handle it. We'll fix it. The nameless one clung to those words like driftwood, because the alternative was admitting what the sun sextile Chiron kept whispering in their ear. Heal by telling the truth. Survive by cutting up the rot. But truth would cost everything to these people, or them. Status, money, the illusion of authority that they had been feeding them for years, and the nameless one had never, ever been trained to heal, only consume. And only to win, not to lose. No was not a complete sentence in their vocabulary. So the friends did what they always did when evidence threatened them. They tried to spiritualize the problem until it stopped becoming a problem. Under a swollen moon, they went to the cemetery with offerings they didn't even understand and prayers borrowed from sources that they never actually respected. They weren't precise. Pisces never is when it's desperate. So the graveyard work bled into everything. Envy, spite, fear, greed. They meant to send the dead after a man they blamed for stirring things up. The man they claimed was the reason the system suddenly cared and started looking. They pictured him unprotected, alone, a soft target for darkness. But he was anything but. That was the part none of them had wanted to believe. Because even when the nameless one first began the fraud, collecting money that didn't belong to them, moving funds like water through hidden channels, forging signatures the way other people sign birthday cards, there had always been this one obstacle. A man who didn't break the way they needed him to. Attempts to smear him failed. Attempts to bait him also failed. Attempts to frighten him had failed. And now, on the night they tried to aim graveyard power at him, the cemetery air turned abruptly cold, as if something ancient had stepped between their words and their world. They felt it before they saw it. A stillness so heavy it made their lungs forget how to pull in breath. Then the candles guttered, not from wind, from absence. As if the flame itself had been taken elsewhere. In the darkness beyond the grave markers, a figure seemed to gather from shadow and moonlight. Skeletal grace, velvet quiet, and unblinking patience that did not feel summoned so much as present. The friends whispered a name they barely understood. Santa Muerte. Half as a joke, half as a plea. The saint did not answer them. She looked past them, toward the man they had tried to harm. Not with affection, though. Not with fury, either. With something worse. Ownership. Protection already in place. A boundary already drawn. The friends' words didn't launch outward. They felt inward. That was the beginning of the binding. The next week, illness started creeping through the group like mold. Headaches that wouldn't lift, stomachs that refused food, fevers that came and went with absolutely no diagnosis. Money slipped away in small humiliations, fees, fines, sudden errors that always landed on the wrong side of the ledger. Their phones began dying on the worst moments, cars that wouldn't start. Relationships cracked for reasons nobody could really explain. It wasn't dramatic enough to prove a curse, and that was the cruelty of it. It looked like life. The kind of life people deserved when they'd spent years sending ruin outward without ever considering the return label. The sun square Lilith in the 12th made it feel like the walls themselves had turned against them. Hidden enemies, shadow consequences, self-undoing emergent from a place no one willingly admitted it existed out loud. And the sun square sensitive degree Uranus in the 8th, that sudden shock in a house of shared money, secrets and debt, made the return swift and chaotic. Accounts started getting frozen, transfers began getting flagged, inconsistencies lighting up like flares in systems designed to detect fraud. Meanwhile, the Nameless One began spiraling, crashing out. They stared at their proof folder, screenshots, templates, forged PDFs, doctored letters, feeling the paper-thin nature of it all. Their confidence, once fueled by performance, turned to rage. With Sun conjunct Mars in the 5th, they were built for spectacle, risk, drama, ego. So panic made them theatrical by all means. And I mean, they were dramatic as ridiculous. They rehearsed explanations in a mirror. They practiced tears. They drafted emails designed to sound cooperative. They told themselves they could still out-talk consequence. Still seduce reality into bending. In private, they smashed a glass in the sink just to hear something break that wasn't their life. Then came the next message. A notice of appearance. It wasn't a weapon. It was an invitation. Clean, official, stamped with the calm authority procedure. It instructed the Nameless One to show up, to appear. To represent a party in a matter where representation required legitimate authority. The notice was written in a language the Nameless One had always feared the most. Not mystical, not emotional, administrative. Cold, verified, and most of all, trackable. It was a trap. The court wasn't asking for the missing document anymore. The court was asking the Nameless One to step into a room where the absence of that document would become undeniable. The Aquarius engine turned. A stellium in Aquarius, Pluto, Moon, Mars, and the Sun, hung over the situation like a surveillance constellation. With the Sun being power, force being Mars, fused with the emotional exposure of the Moon and the irreversible consequence of Pluto, the group had once believed the world could be bribed or distracted. But Aquarius isn't persuaded by pleading. It's persuaded by proof. Verifiable proof. Systems don't care how convincing you sound. Systems care what you can produce. On the morning of the hearing, the Nameless One dressed carefully. They chose clothes that said respectable, the way a mask says face. They arrived early and stood in the hallway pretending to scroll their phone while watching every passerby with predator eyes. They told themselves the room would be full of people that they could charm. Look at me. They told themselves that the official would be soft. They told themselves the judge would be bored. But inside, the room was awake. A clerk called names. A bailiff moved with quiet finality. Attorneys sat with folders that looked heavy enough to bruise. When the Nameless One's turn came, they walked forward with the same confidence they had used in 100 scams. Until the first question landed. Produce the document authorizing you. Absolute silence. The Nameless One's mind flashed through every version of the lie that they've ever told. The Pisces Mercury in them, the part that could spin fog into a bridge, reached for the usual tools. Delay, diversion, charm. They began speaking anyway, the way drowning people kick. Not because it helps, but because stopping feels like it's like death. There were complications. It's in transit. I was advised. Produce it, the judge said. The phrase was repeated, calm as gravity. They couldn't. And in that moment, the fraud didn't unravel. It crystallized. It became visible. At that point, it was official. The judge didn't rage. The judge didn't even mock. The judge simply noted, recorded, documented, and sealed that the nameless one had appeared without authority and had been collecting money under false pretenses. The law didn't need the cemetery to punish. It had its own graveyard, made of paper. Outside the courthouse, the friends' phones lit up with new problems at the exact same time. Accounts flagged, investigations widened, peripheral accomplices contacted, the binding tightened, their health worsened, their finances started to bleed. It was as if the very thing they tried to send outward had turned and begun listing their names. Then the doctor fell. The nameless one had used a medical professional as a printing press, illegal documentation to lend legitimacy to fraud, notes written to justify payments, diagnoses shaped to fit narratives, privacy violated casually, as if other people's bodies were just files to exploit. They had told themselves the doctor was safe, he was protected, too embedded to be touched. But the Aquarius machine doesn't protect, it processes. The indictments came like a guillotine: conspiracy, privacy violations, fraud, malpractice, charges stacked like stones. The sentence was not a rumor or a threat. It was a number. 20 years. A lifetime measured in fluorescent prison light. That was when the nameless one finally understood what had happened. They hadn't been undone by a single official's call. They'd been undone by the thing they'd mocked for years. Consequence. A ledger that does not forget, a system, spiritual or legal, depending on what you believe, that eventually pulls every hidden wire into view. In the last scene, the nameless one returned home to the framed fakes, the cozy lies, the Venus, lit domestic altar they'd built around deception. They opened their laptop and saw the man's face again. Still speaking online, still calm. While comments flooded in like an incoming tide, the friends had tried to summon death to silence him. Instead, they summoned attention. And attention, in this season, was the sharpest blade of them all. Because once a mask is recorded as a mask, it can never pass as a face again. And with that blade, it was the final of the 1,000 insert set song. That's all I have for you guys today. Hopefully you found it entertaining. Make good choices.